To think of them as like a watercolor. Does that make sense? So it's mostly water to less material. So they're far thinner, meaning more water content than a glaze. There are many things that you can do with stains and washes, but to understand the difference between the two, a stain is exactly how it sounds. You're using it to stain your piece. So the concentration of it, or the saturation of that stain, is a lot more water to a lot less material. Now, washes are particular in that they're typically at least a little bit heavier concentration or saturation than a stain, but they're definitely denser. A lot of times when people say a wash, they mean an oxide. So for example, these bright colors in these little jars, these are colored stains. So the difference between a colored stain and an oxide wash is typically nowadays, a stain is made with a mason stain. So basically pigments that are mixed together, or I should say minerals, so metals that are mixed together to make a specific color, all right? So the mason stain is gonna have a variety of different metals combined together to make that color. Whereas an oxide wash is completely from scratch on your own. You're mixing, for example, cobalt carbonate or copper carbonate or iron oxide with that water, as well as a flux. So regardless of which one you're using, a stain or an oxide wash, you definitely want to have what's called a flux mixed into it with the water and the pigment that you're making, because that flux is going to help do two things. It's going to help that pigment adhere to your piece. Okay, does that make sense when it gets fired? All right, especially if you're going to put it over a glaze, which I'm going to show you how you can do that. Because that's also an option. You don't have to just put it straight on the clay. It's also going to help that pigment sustain higher temperatures, because a lot of times, especially the pure metals like iron oxide, cobalt, copper, chrome, those are typically melting at a very low temperature, all right? So to help withstand those metals to go to a higher temperature, you want to mix them with a flux, what's called a stain or a wash. You want to keep stirring it as much as possible, because there's so much water content to them. That little bit of material that's in it settles really fast, all right? So that's why I have a second brush in here to keep it as my stir, basically. So I'm gonna start with a colored stain. This is ginger orange, and I prefer to use a calligraphy brush or a bamboo brush, because a lot of times they hold a lot more liquid than your cheap kind of horsehair brush, and the bristles or the hair is softer. Okay, so you can get a lot more out of it depending on what you're doing. Now, with stains and washes, if you do want to embark on them in any fashion, regardless of what you're doing and how you're applying them, I do recommend that you use your brush before you start applying it to your piece. Load up your brush and have a blank piece of paper in front of you and do a line test, so that you have a good idea of what kind of saturation you're working with. So that's the ginger orange that I just applied on this cut. Okay, whereas, and I can show you the difference between it and an oxide wash, such as the black ink here, which is the Studio's. So this will typically live right behind Sherry, where the commercial glazes are. But this is an oxide wash. It's not to be confused with an underglaze or a commercial glaze. But to show you the difference in saturation, the consistency looks the same, right? Even though they're a little different color, obviously. But when I do that line test, that's far denser and almost opaque in comparison. Change the ratio, for example. So if you want it to be thinner, you can just have more water content to it, right? If you want it to be more concentrated like the wash, you can reduce that water content. Okay. Now that is the way you want to approach your color. So if I wanted this to be more concentrated, because that looks really faint, and I did already apply it on this ring here, so you can see it on this ring, and that's just one quick coat. Now, as you can see, it is translucent. It's a very thin coat. So if I wanted this to be a solid color, more like something like this, you can even tell on the bottom of this tray, it's not uniform. It's not an even thickness. I would want to do another coat of that ginger orange if I wanted it to be a flat color. But because I put this on the bottom of my piece, I want to be careful of how much I put there, because this is going to go on the kiln shelf. And even though this isn't a glaze, it has flux in it. So I don't want to put too much and it's going to stick a little bit to the kiln shelf, right? So I do want to be mindful of that. So I'm going to load up my brush, but this is one way you can use a stain, is by filling in a pattern that you have. Now, usually one coat suffices. I don't need to do 3 like a commercial glaze. I don't need to look for a thickness as if I had dipped this in a glaze. It's a very thin coat, and if I'm filling in a pattern like this, I basically want to look for this kind of saturation that I don't see my brush strokes underneath it as I let that stain fill that area. So if I start to, for example, do this in the same spot, you see it's wanting to lift and move that stain around.
Yeah.
So if I want to fill in a certain spot, I don't want that to happen. So that's another reason why I prefer bamboo brushes, is I can just barely touch the surface of my piece and the stain just kind of puddles in place where I want it. But I don't want to see the clay underneath that unless that's what I want. Which brings me to another way of working with stain. So I can put these under a glaze or over a glaze. So for example, on this tray, I'm going to use the black ink, the oxide wash. I'm going to just loosely go over my rim. The other thing you want to keep in mind with an oxide wash is, because, as I mentioned earlier, these are far denser with the types of materials that are in them, a tiny bit goes a long way. Where it lands, it's staying. Even if you wipe it off, for example, if I load up my sponge here, so a damp sponge, it's not filled with water, but if I wipe that off, that's not going to burn off. It's there, right? So if you did want a stain, which is what that just did, you can do that. But it's obviously not going to be nearly as potent in its saturation than if I do it or leave it how I originally applied it around the rim. Especially if you like gradients or that watercolor effect, especially once you do apply your glaze. So for example, this T-ball, yeah, you see how the blue oxide wash just started to ever so slightly start to bleed with the glaze. Yeah. So that's also something to take into consideration, whether you're doing Mishima like this or my pieces here and inlaying it into a design, or if you're doing something like this. So if I dip this in the clear, for example, or the water blue, which is a transparent glaze, it's going to encourage that stain to bleed with that glaze and create a nice effect. So that's just adds to like doing accents, like I explained in the glaze demo. But the other thing you can do with these Make sure my brush is clean before I stick it in the next color. Make sure that's mixed. Is you can also layer these, but you do want to be careful. So if I did, for example, this, where I'm kind of just gently going over that black ink, I don't want to apply too much over that. It can cause that area, especially with the oxide wash, they can be too thick, in which case they'll turn black and they'll get pretty crusty and probably get an effect that you don't want. But you can overlap these, especially if you want like a gradient kind of thing, or like, for example, a stain, and you want to wipe that away. For example, this guy.
Like different saturation levels.
Exactly. And in which case, so since I started with, or I'm working with an orange and a black, right? Let's say, so this bowl was from the Mishima and Sgraffito demo. I inlaid the yellow into some of those lines and the background is red. But let's say I want to, not just make those other lines black, but I want to actually stain the whole piece. And I'm not going to do the whole thing, just so that you have a good comparison between where it's going to be stained and where it's not. So because of the saturation of this black, I don't want to leave this half of the bowl like that. That's a little too much. So what I can do, especially if I just want to make this a little bit darker and kind of gory, you'll know what I mean once this is fired. But those lines are now going to be black, and that red has just been stained black. So it's not going to be as bright on this side as it is on this side. It'll still be red, but just not as bright. And as you can tell, that line is not going to fade. But let's say I did want it to fade, so to speak.
Kind of like an ombre?
I can go in really quickly with a little bit of that, and I don't need to be perfect, but I can load my brush up with water and work it like a watercolor.
Cool.
That's how Amy did her line work and her stain work on that cut.
So you're kind of pulling back that stain with the water? Okay.
Now, the other thing I can do is add a little bit of this, making sure it's mixed up well, but add some of this to a smaller container and add more water to it to really make it more of a diluted saturation. And before I apply it to my piece, do a line test. So if you really want it to just be like a faint stain, like so. So that's not going to be nearly as dark as the other side. But this can also help me blend that center area together better and help with making gradients. Does that make sense? Do you guys have any questions so far?
Not yet.
Okay. You can also be pretty painterly, whether you're doing just like spirals, for example, or stripes, or if you're doing figures or landscapes. But you can slowly work that stain, especially if you want something more like a gradient. This is probably a better example of that than the bowl, because that was on over a fired underglaze. But yeah, just like the underglazes, you can be pretty painterly with these, but just keep in mind those are going to move when you put a clear glaze over them versus an underglazes. Underglazes are less likely to do that. Underglazes, speaking of underglazes, you can use an underglaze. So let's say you're not yet at that level where you're ready to make your own stain, or we don't have the kind of stain that you want to use, but you have an underglaze. You can use an underglaze as a stain. So for example, the black, you want to give it a good shake so it's all consistent. But because of how diluted the stains are, you just want to add a little bit of that underglaze. Not very much. And then add some clean water to it. Not very much. But obviously more than double the amount of underglaze you have in there, and make sure you stir it really well so it's not all trapped in your brush and you're actually mixing it up with that water. But you can use underglaze as a stain or a wash. In the same way. So it's a nice gray right now. And you can layer this as well. And then come back in with water if you want that to be a little bit softer gradient, and work some of that out. I can also do this with my sponge, but that's more than likely going to lift more rather than working it around like the brush. And that's another way you can use these is, I'm going to use my dirty water, but you can use these as literally a stain to stain your whole piece. So if you don't want like that richer saturation, I can load up a sponge and just rub it into my piece. But I don't want that robust color. I just want the clay to be stained. And especially if I did put clear over this, it's going to be really faint. However, let's say I brushed one of these on this whole thing, right? And I let it dry overnight. When I wipe it away later, it's actually gonna, that concentration of stain is gonna be much heavier than this right now, because the clay is wet after applying that stain, right? It's holding on to that moisture, just like wiping your bisque off when you're ready to glaze it, and then you start glazing it. It's holding all that water. Even though it doesn't feel like it's freshly wet, you can touch it without lifting that glaze, right? But that water content is still in there. So if I let it dry, that stain is really, really, really on there. I'm less likely to lift as much when I start wiping it away than if I had wiped it off immediately after applying it. Because if I wipe it off immediately after applying it, between the water content that bisque is absorbing and the water that's in the sponge, even though it's not filled with water, it's damp, right? But I need it to be damp in order to lift some of that off. So it's gonna lift more of that pigment off the wetter this is. Now also coming back to this, this underglaze, even though it's settled, I can go back in there with a brush, but because that's just a tiny amount of water, if I dump this back into the underglaze container, it's not gonna hurt it, right? So it's not like I've added water to this, right, to turn it into a stain. But, so that's nice. You're not wasting material. You can use these under a glaze, whether you're doing a gradient or not. This planter, I've waxed the inside and the bottom. I already started staining this, as you can tell. So one thing you can do is use them for your signature, whether you're actually using it to sign your work, that's an option. But again, you want to be careful of the concentration of it, right? So it doesn't stick to the shelf. Or if you sign your work, what I did in here was I went in with that stain and then wiped it away, so it really makes my signature pop. Now, if you just want a subtle stain on your piece, you can do that. You can apply it and wipe it away so it's a stain, right? And then you can layer these so that you can make layers kind of like in watercolor and get some nice shading or gradients or whatever you're doing, or designs. So whether you want to do, so that's a pretty low concentration, right? That's another reason why you want to, depends on the brush you're using too, makes a huge impact. But that's much better, but it's still pretty faint. So if you want something to bleed with the glaze, you would want to put it under the glaze. If you want it to be a little bit more prominent, you would put it over the glaze, especially if your glaze is opaque. Take that into consideration as well. So that's a quick and easy thing you can do. And I can come in with another color, but I want to let that dry. That way I'm less likely to lift that off and get that in my next stain, and especially if I want that to stay there. So if I want to stain my whole piece, for example, like I did this one, ideally I would want to apply that quick, and then just like glazing, just let it rest for a little while because it just absorbed a lot of water, right? And if you really want your piece to be stained well, give it time to dry. When I do mine, even though I'm inlaying it, I always give them overnight. That way I don't lift a lot of that stain out of where I just put it. And I'm giving the clay a lot more time to absorb and hold it. So it really becomes part of my piece. Take a close look at these. So these are 3 different colored stains, all right? These are Fire to Cone 6. These are actually just Fire to Bisque, actually, no, these are Fire to Cone 6 as well. These are on the same clay body that we're using in class. So that's BMX Smooth. Now you can tell with the thin saturation of this dark pink, it was really difficult to get a nice even coat of it. It just wants to move around. So that's why it looks all splotchy on here. But if you look closely at the bottom, it looks a lot different without glaze over it. So sometimes putting a glaze over that pigment or that colored stain or wash dilutes it. And sometimes it actually enhances the color. So down here at the bottom is where it's not glazed. This is deep orchid, but up here it's a beautiful bright violet. It's gorgeous. But that's just a really good example of how tricky it is to get an even coat of them because of how much water to far less materials in them.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if you're going to compare them to an underglaze or a commercial glaze. These are also fire to cone 6, but these is a comparison between a white clay on the left half and a dark clay, as you can tell. This is a red clay on the right half. And then the bottom is what it looks like with a clear glaze over it. The top half is what it looks like without the clear glaze. So, in that pink, like, the clear glaze actually helps maintain that color, especially. This is a big reason why stains and washes came about in the first place, is you can create a lot of visual depth when you put it over a texture. You see that? Whether you wipe it away so it's only in that texture or not, over a glaze. To do the same thing I did on this tray, for example, if I wanted to do a rim or like just like a swirl or a circle or a line, doesn't matter. Just some kind of accent, I can do that over the glaze. The difference between doing it over versus under, one is going to encourage that oxide wash to flow with the glaze more. All right. Typically, it's when you put it over the glaze. It's going to be much more pronounced in color as well when you put it over the glaze versus under. But again, that also depends on how that stain or wash is formulated. Some people like it much more concentrated, some people don't. Sometimes depending on that pigment or oxide or mason stain, so everybody likes them a little bit different saturation. So some people like more flux to less pigment. I like my colored stains to be equal parts, so 1 to 1. But especially because of oxide washes, because they're so dense, most times those are actually a lot more flux to oxide. Ink. So this has several different oxides and carbonates into it with glass formers and fluxes. So that's the other thing about washes, is they're all a little different in how they are formulated to get the result that you want. Mason stains are typically a 1 to 1 ratio depending on the saturation that you desire. The stem of the chalice, right? I can come in with my brush and whether I want it just stained like so. So that's a quick way of staining. It's not too thick. I don't immediately like not see that texture like I would the black ink. And the nice thing is you can quickly go over your foot too, and they won't stick. With oxide washes, I don't recommend you do that until you become more familiar with it. But a stain, because they're not quite as dense. See, it just went into my signature, and it created that depth. Yeah, because oxide washes are far denser and they melt at a lower temperature, they may not stick to the shelf like a glaze, but they will have a little bit of debris from the kiln shelf. So just to prevent you from having more work later.
So even if you put on like, just saying like 6 layers of that, it won't like run, or it'll just get more saturated?
Yep. I don't recommend 6 layers, so you don't get a texture you don't like. But
Okay.
yeah, typically, I mean, unless this were like this kind of very thin saturation, I don't recommend that many coats.
Okay.
Yeah.
So max 3?
I probably wouldn't do more than 2.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just because it's just that concentrated?
Well, it's to prevent thicker areas from creating that texture and that result that more than likely you don't want.
Mm-hmm.
Just until you become really familiar with this as a material and how it responds to your clay, to your work, and how you're using it, as well as with glaze. And that will help you determine like what kind of saturation you want, especially with like that little sponge holder that you have out there, that you have all that applique on. Like the stains are and the washes are perfect to get those little embellishments some depth with the teeth. But you can also use these to be more painterly as well. So if you wanted to just do the teeth like a specific color, but you want to keep it a natural matte texture and surface. You don't have to put glaze over these. You can also leave them bare and you can do multiple colors, right? So, but because this one isn't stained yet, I did these first so that these two could dry. That way by the time I do this one, I don't have to worry about these two being damp. And these won't stick together after they get fired. That's the nice thing. They might act like they're a little stuck, but they'll pop right off after the firing. Now, I'm going to stir this. I've already got some mason stain on the stem of this chalice. So that's the ginger orange, just like here. But I've got wax resist over it because I applied glaze on the cup itself, inside and out. So I wanted to mask that stain, okay? So that I don't get too much of that glaze on here. Or I had to hold it by the stem where it was already stained in order to glaze this. Now I could have done the glazing first, that's fine. But because I had already stained this first, I don't want to touch this and then smear it around or lift it and have it all over my fingers and forget and then start touching my piece. Where stain lands, it's gonna stay. Even if you try and wipe it off and it looks really faint like this, it's still there. So whether I put a clear glaze over this or not, it's not gonna be the pure clay body once it's fired, right? So you wanna be mindful of that. Now, what I'm gonna do in addition to this glaze and the ginger orange stain on the bottom, I'm gonna stir the black ink a little bit because it is settling. And I'm gonna grab a brush. Now you can get really detailed, you can get painterly, you can overlap these, you can do gradients, you can be very loose with them as well. So for example, on here, I'm just gonna do the rim very loosely. Just like that. I'm not bothered by the fact that it's not even. So it looks a little jagged around the edge. But if I really wanna encourage that oxide wash to really meld and flow with this glaze, this is apricot, or no, it's not apricot. It's a Supernova, it's a commercial glaze. And I know it's gonna have a subtle flow to it. But because that wash has some flux and glass formers in it, it's gonna melt with that glaze and look as if I combined two glazes over the other. So it'll give it a nice effect. So that's one way you can do accents with these, okay? You're not limited to doing them under a glaze or without a glaze, okay? But if you're doing the inside of a functional piece, you obviously want to put a food safe glaze over that so your piece is sealed. Now I can also do another accent if I wanted to on this. This one, I did ginger orange on the base. I actually did the black ink on the rim, and then I did a band underneath that of the ginger orange. Now I've already glazed this with the apricot, so I'm gonna see what that looks like under a glaze that moves when it melts. And then I'm also gonna come in over the glaze, and I'm gonna do this guy so that we can see how it'll interact over it as well. Just something quick and easy. So we'll see how that melts in comparison to when a stain and a wash is under it, right? As well as just the difference of thickness. So these drops look thicker than when I was moving the brush, right? So that'll be a good example for that. Is you can use Underglaze or Glaze as a stain. So for example, on this mug, somebody else glazed it, but they wiped it off so that it's only in the texture. And that's one way you can create depth. Now this looks like they did the same thing, but honestly, it looks like, because this glaze has a lot of copper in it, but where they had wiped it off, that's what copper carbonate wash does. So even though it looks like they used a glaze for this, but if you had a copper carb wash or probably even a copper oxide wash, you would get this green color. But that's a nice gradient way of how you can use a glaze as a stain as well. It creates a lot of depth and it gets a lot of detail to come forward, right? Now, coming back to using it in line work and Mishima, if you're gonna use it for Mishima because there's so much water content to that stain or wash, I recommend you apply it to bone dry clay, not leather hard like you would an underglaze or a slip. That way you have that absorption in your clay to really grab that stain or wash, and less likely to remove too much than what you want if you're gonna wipe it away where you don't want it, all right? So, but that is an option. You can apply it to greenware like I did on these 2 cups. But most of the time you're applying it to bisqueware, whether that's over a glaze or under a glaze. So more about putting oxide washes on bone dry greenware. This was the black ink. I loosely brushed it on. This is bone dry plate. All right, and as you can see, this looks pretty thick. It did puddle, so what you want to be aware of is you want to maybe move that around so that that puddle doesn't stay in one spot and cause your greenware, your bone dry greenware, to start to disintegrate and cause a crack or worse. That's one thing. Additionally, when I have spoken about my Mishima bisqueware in this demonstration, I have wax resist on that greenware so that when I inlay that oxide wash into the line patterns that I've drawn through the wax into the clay, then I let that piece dry, bone dry, and then the stain or the wash is inlaid into that pattern. Okay, so if you're gonna put a stain on greenware, I suggest you make sure that greenware is bone dry, but again, be careful to make sure that you're not leaving a puddle and causing damage to your piece. And also, you can put these on leather hard or past leather hard, but not bone dry. But you don't want to do an application that requires you to remove it, because then you're going to possibly make an effect you don't want. You're more than likely going to rub a lot of that stain into the clay, not remove it, okay, and possibly cause more damage to your bone dry greenware. That's why if you are going to put it on greenware, I suggest that it be bone dry and it be either loose, like a quick pattern of sorts, or some other kind of accent, like doing the rim, or signing your work. That way you're less likely to create any damage. Also, you don't want to need to remove it. So if you want to stain the whole thing, you can do that on bone dry greenware. But if you're wanting to remove any of that wash or stain, I don't recommend you put it on greenware unless you're going to put wax resist on it in the area where you are going to apply it and where you don't want that stain or wash to stay. so that when you do add that damp sponge or wet sponge to remove where you don't want it, you're not adding more and more moisture to that greenware and causing some damage to it, like a crack, or worse, causing it to disintegrate. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. Lines where the wash didn't fully get in there. I could come in with a very tiny brush and try and work it into that, or I could try and stain the whole thing again. But that's going to affect my bisqueware. So it's because I don't inlay that oxide when it's bisque. I do it when it's still green. But that is an option. I don't recommend trying to use these with an applicator tool, because odds are it's just going to pour out of there. You don't even need to squeeze it to apply the stain or the wash to get out of that applicator tool and onto your piece. It'll just start to drip because of how much water. You guys have any questions?
If you put a stain or a wash over glaze, it becomes not food safe.
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
No. If you put it on the inside of dinnerware, right, something you want to eat or drink out of, you definitely want to put a food safe glaze over it.
Over it.
Yeah,
Okay.
so it's sealed. You don't have to worry about any of that technical stuff. Yeah, just like using glaze.
So if
You don't want to put a not food safe glaze on the inside of your bowl.
if you were gonna like want that to be food safe, would you just put clear over that?
Over this? No. No, it's still going to be food safe.
Because it will mix with the glaze.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. When it comes to stains, in my experience, because I've been using them for a very long time, the more you do on a piece, especially straight on bisque, I recommend you bisque fire it before you glaze it. All right. So with my work, I mean, all of this is going to be filled in, right? So I would want to re-bisque this to adhere all of those on there. That way, when I do glaze this with clear, I'm less likely to lift any of those stains, smudge them around, because that's the other thing. Because they don't have much material to them, when you touch them, even though they're dry, you can smear them and have it on your finger and then touch your next piece and it's on your next piece. Let's say you're crunched for time, right? Which is realistic, it happens. Definitely let your piece dry for at least an hour, just so you're less likely to have any of that lift and possibly contaminate your glaze.